For those of you just joining us, welcome. Robin Roscoe will share her expertise with us on project stakeholders. Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and welcome everybody. Good morning or good afternoon to wherever you happen to be. I'm going to be focusing today on stakeholders and risk assessment. Just a quick reminder of the agenda for this workshop series. We're going to be looking at the principles of project management and then the whole project lifecycle from initiation through to closing. Last time we covered the principles of project management and project initiation, as well as some key elements of documentation and definitions. In summary, what we talked about last time, we defined a project as a unique, time-framed, and progressively elaborated endeavor, focusing on solving a problem or answering a question. Project management looks at a project lifecycle as going from initiating to planning, controlling and monitoring, execution and closing. And there are 10 elements to project management that we will be considering throughout the life of this workshop. We lastly looked at some key definitions, including objectives, deliverables, constraints, and assumptions. And those key items will continue to be relevant for the rest of the discussion that we're going to have in the course. Today, we're going to focus on stakeholders and particularly defining their requirements and expectations, and then we'll look at doing a risk assessment, all as part of the planning of a project. So starting off by looking at stakeholders, there are 4 different types of stakeholders that we can consider in a project. The first are those who are actively involved in the project. And so this would include the people that are going to conduct the work of the project, the decision makers of the project. Sometimes this includes the people that want the work to be done. So these are the ones that have the problem to solve or the question to answer. The second group to think about are those individuals or organizations who exert an influence over the project. So these would be individuals or groups who don't necessarily want or need the outcome of the project to happen, but they have an influence over whether and how the project will be executed. A third group of stakeholders would be those who are affected by the execution of the project or the completion of the project. So in other words, the project will impact these stakeholders. So these would be people, again, not necessarily people who would be doing the work, but people who are in the vicinity of where the work is going to be happening on the project, and so they will be affected by the execution. Perhaps there will be some disruptions to the way that they conduct their work or the places that they live, or if our project is going to result in a change to an environment, the individuals and groups who are in that area will be affected by the completion because their environment will now be different. The last group of stakeholders to consider are those who are interested in the execution or outcome. So these would be stakeholders. It's a bit of a misnomer for them because these are stakeholders that don't have a stake in what's going on, but they have an interest in what's going on. Maybe they are people who are doing work in similar areas and so are interested in the way in which the project is going to be done because they want to learn from it. Maybe they are interested members of the general public who just have a curiosity or a desire to know and be kept informed about what's happening on the project. But they don't exert an influence, they don't actively do any work involved in the project, and whether or not the project achieves its objectives doesn't impact them directly, other than the fact that they are interested in it. All 4 of these groups of stakeholders need to be considered when developing a project plan, because all of these individuals and organizations will have requirements and expectations that can help define the way in which you're going to do the project, the specific tasks that you'll take on, and the way you're going to manage the project, particularly around project communications. But they will also, to some extent, contribute to defining the product. What is the thing that you're going to do or make or explore in your project in order to address the question or solve the problem that you're working towards? Stakeholders will have both requirements and expectations, and there's a subtle difference between those two, which I'll touch on in a second. When we think about our stakeholders, we want to try and identify those stakeholders who we would consider to be primary. And so we can assess these based on their level of influence and their level of interest. Stakeholders with a high level of influence, as well as a high level of interest or involvement in the work that's going to go on in the project, would be considered primary stakeholders. But it's really important not to forget about the other stakeholders. You may have stakeholders, those people that fall into that interested category, who would land in the box associated with being a secondary stakeholder. They would have a high level of interest, but a low level of influence. It's important, though, to not forget about them because they can move very quickly to being stakeholders with a high level of influence if they want to make their interest known to other stakeholders who have a high level of influence. For example, if we are talking about a member of the general public who has some questions or concerns about the way a project is being conducted or what the outcomes of a project will be, and we don't pay attention to addressing the concerns and expectations of those stakeholders, they can take their expectations and concerns to other stakeholders who do have an influence, and suddenly they can become stakeholders with a high degree of influence over your project. And that can be quite disruptive, particularly if that happens after the project execution has already begun. So you want to make sure that you understand who those stakeholders are and what their requirements and expectations are so that you can make a plan for addressing them. This doesn't mean that you need to address and satisfy all of the requirements and expectations of all stakeholders, but you do need to understand what they are, and if you're not going to be able to meet those expectations, be able to explain to them why. When we think about requirements and expectations, there is a difference between those two things. Requirements are exactly that. They are explicit, well-defined, usually written down, rules and regulations or guidelines around what exactly a project is required to do to meet the needs of a stakeholder group. So for example, if we're talking about a regulatory body, that would be a stakeholder with a high level of influence, not necessarily a high level of interest, but a high level of influence over a project and whether it's going to be successful. And the requirements of regulators and legislatures, legislative bodies will usually be very explicit, so written down somewhere, objective, so it's very clear what it is you have to do in order to meet those requirements, and quantifiable, so something that you can measure. Expectations are harder to define. Oftentimes, stakeholders can't really even express what it is that they expect. Sometimes they can only express their disappointment that their expectations have not been met, but don't necessarily have the capacity to express what it is that they do want or need from the project. So expectations are often implicit and are often qualitative. They can sometimes relate more to how stakeholders feel about their level of involvement rather than specifically around what it is that they need. Taking some time with each of the stakeholder groups to understand what their requirements and expectations are, and then incorporating as much of that into the plan for the project. Again, not necessarily what you will do on the project, but how you will communicate information about the project and its progress back to these stakeholders so that you can help address their expectations, not necessarily meet them, but at least allow those stakeholders to feel that they have been heard and that their concerns have been considered, if not necessarily addressed. A way to think about the difference between requirements and expectations and why it's important to understand them as best as possible is exemplified with this little graphic here. On the left-hand side, we have an example of if we were to get a client, a stakeholder, to describe to us what it was that they wanted us to build for them. It may be that when we hear what they say, this is what it looks like. This is what we would draw based on what it was that they described to us. Something that hangs from a tree, that they can swing on, and that they can climb on. But if we look at what they actually had in mind, you can see that the same description works for both of these images, but they are quite a bit different in terms of the what it is that we end up with. One of them obviously takes a lot more work to build, uses different materials, and perhaps represents a different kind of result than what the stakeholder would have been looking for, and certainly the level of work that we would have to put into it. So taking the time to really understand what it is that's needed by the stakeholders can go a long way to making sure that we do the right work in the project and we end up with a product that solves the problem or addresses the question as it's raised. I'm just going to take a pause there and see if anybody has any questions. Please use the chat box in your Zoom tool to ask any questions that you might have. All right. So when we think about the requirements and the expectations of the stakeholders that we're working with, we can classify these into three separate categories. The first is mandatory. These are requirements that absolutely have to be met. These are things that if we don't do them, the product that we generate in our project or the outcome that we come to as a result of our work will not meet the requirements and expectations, will not address the question or solve the problem in the way that we need it to. So these would be things that absolutely have to happen. Desirable requirements would be things that would be noted as something that it would be nice to have if we can accomplish that, but we're only going to achieve those things or work towards those things if we get to the point in the project where we see that we have the means we have sufficient time or we have sufficient resources to be able to add those things into the project without causing the project to be late or go over budget or not meet any of the mandatory requirements. So achieving a desirable requirement doesn't take the place of missing a mandatory requirement. So we have to meet all of the mandatory requirements, and then if there are desirable ones that we can achieve as well, then we can proceed with those, making sure that we make a conscious decision to understand the impacts of those additional pieces of work. Optional requirements would be things that we identify through the course of the project that weren't identified at the beginning. They weren't seen as mandatory or even desirable requirements, but as the project proceeds, it becomes apparent that those would be things that we might also be able to achieve in our project. And again, we have a conversation and discussion around, would that be something that would make sense to add into the work that we're doing? So those would be opportunistic things that we might see as a result of the work that we're doing. But again, we would need to make sure that we're not doing those things in the place of meeting any of the mandatory requirements. A really simple way to think about these kinds of requirements is to think about if you were buying a car. You might have some mandatory requirements for buying the car. It has to have 4 doors, it has to have air conditioning, it has to have power windows and a big huge trunk. And those would be 4 things that whatever car it is that you buy has to have those things. A desirable requirement might be like heated seats and heated mirrors. That would be nice to have because we live in an area where cold is an issue, and we want, it would be nice to have that to be a little bit more comfortable, but we're not willing to sacrifice the great big huge trunk in order to have that as a requirement. If we can include it without going over our budget, then that would be nice. An optional requirement might be what the color of the car is. I would really like it if the car was blue, but I'm willing to take it that the car is gray or green because I am able to get my other requirements met as well. Or maybe there are some additional safety features that we didn't know about that as we're looking at buying the car, we become aware of them, and they become things that, yes, we do want to incorporate those in the purchase of the car. So we can classify our requirements in that way, things that we absolutely need to have, things that it would be nice if we could have, and things that we learn about as we're developing our project that we recognize as being good to have or possible to include in our project. All of these things are related to the aspect of quality, or how good our our product of our project needs to be in order to achieve the objectives of our project. And we're going to talk about quality in the next session in a little bit more detail, but we'll be getting some of our information about the quality requirements from what we've defined as our stakeholder requirements. So a quick summary about stakeholders. We can classify our stakeholders in one of four ways: their level of involvement, their level of influence, their level of interest, and the level of impact on them either during the execution of the work or at the completion of the project. And thinking about the impact is related to issues around change management. And if we're going to be changing something about an environment, about the way people do things, we do need to think about how that's going to impact them when we develop our project and its goals and deliverables. And we need to think about the requirements and expectations of all of those stakeholders and whether those are mandatory, desirable, or optional. Okay, hopefully all of you still have access to the case studies that we distributed with the slides. So looking at the first scenario, and looking specifically at the research project piece of that scenario, not the development of the proposal, but the actual conduct of the research project, who would you say are the key stakeholders in that particular project? And again, please use the chat box on the side to contribute to the discussion on this topic. So we have the community members and the elders. The communities are a big part of it. The PIs, Doctors Smith, Matthews, and Bridger. Yep, lots of emphasis on the communities. The funding agency is definitely a stakeholder. Anyone else who might be involved in the work? The trainees are stakeholders. Yes, indeed they are. So when I look at this, I would think immediately that the PIs are key stakeholders. They're both involved in and to a large extent influencing the work that will be done. It was their original question that the research work is going to be trying to answer, questions, excuse me. The institutions where the work will take place, as well as the funding agencies, are stakeholders that have a significant level of influence over the project and the work as it's going to be conducted. The institution, of course, for allowing the work to take place within the institutions and providing the administrative mechanisms for people to travel and to host the trainees, etc. And the funder making the decision to fund the project and probably providing some conditions around the funding and how it's going to be used. And so they would have a role to play in influencing the project itself. The trainees and the field workers would be involved in terms of the conduct of the work, and you could even say that the trainees would be impacted by the project because what they learn throughout the course of the project will impact them in their lives if this is the project that they're doing in order to satisfy their degree requirements. Then of course this would be something that would impact their future, and the field workers would be involved in the project by conducting the work. The study population, so the communities where the work is going to be happening would be impacted by the work simply because there's people there doing research. You could the environment, the populations of the animals that they're going to be looking at will be influenced. Yeah, that's a good one. The industries, somebody's pointed out that the tourism industry and other industries such as fishing could be impacted by the project outcomes. That's a really good point. Those might be stakeholders. For example, the local fishing community might be an example of a stakeholder group that's potentially impacted by the work that's going to be done, but you don't necessarily know that until you conduct the research. But they probably are an example of a group that would be interested in what the project was going to accomplish. And so engaging them very early in the development and execution of the project could go a long way to ensuring that their role as a stakeholder remains in the interested and secondary category, and that they don't become adversarial and have some kind of influence over the project and the way that it's going to be done. And lastly, the Research Ethics Board would be a group that I would include as a stakeholder because they have a significant role to play in approving the work that's going to be done, so giving that ethics approval for the interactions with the people in the community. Certainly, if there might be animal ethics involved as well, that you would have to make sure that you're satisfying, and other regulatory bodies for some of the work that would be done within the environment might also be people that would need to be there. And lastly, somebody suggested policymakers who may appreciate the evidence to make informed decisions. Definitely, they would be stakeholders. I probably would put them in the secondary or tertiary category because their involvement or interest would depend largely on what the outcomes of the research would be, which you won't know until the work has actually begun. But they could be part of the group that influences what you do if they have specific questions or things that could be addressed by the conduct of the work. And so maybe including their expectations or desires as desirable or optional requirements would be a way to enhance the value of the study, as long as the original mandatory objectives of the study could still be met. Okay, thanks everybody for contributing to that. Let's look at one more, the case study number 3, which is about relocating the office. So who would we say are the key stakeholders in this particular project? Yep, you and your office mates, or me and my office mates. The moving company. Anyone else? We're talking about the scenario that's looking at the relocation of the office from one spot to another. The projects that rely on the work not being interrupted, yep, those would potentially be stakeholders in the project. The landlords, the old and new landlords would definitely be there. Oh, the neighbors, that's a good one. Yeah, there would. I think we've touched on most of these. So the office mates, the people that that occupy the space who are going to be moved, the moving company would be a key stakeholder. Their commitment to be there on the day that they need to be there, and their ability to move all of the things that they say they're going to be able to move. So making sure that they can do that. The IT and phone support people, so making sure that when the switchover happens, that it's done as seamlessly as possible. In my own experience, that never happens without a hiccup of some kind. So making sure that as much of that is buttoned down as possible. The people involved in the facilities or the landlords of the two locations, and then lastly the customers or the clients or the collaborators, whoever it is that that your office would be interacting with. Those would be stakeholders. Certainly people who would be impacted by the change, and would certainly perhaps also have an influence over when and how the change was going to happen. Okay. Thanks everyone for participating in those. We're going to move on now and talk about risk. And risk is one of another one of the 10 elements of project management, and it's defined or identified as risk management and the things that you would do to manage risks within a project. So we would define risk from a project perspective as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on the project objectives. And we often only think about risks as being negative. We talk about things as being risky. We talk about risks that we don't want to take. And so we often see risks as being negative, but truly risks are things that can be either positive or negative. The thing that we do is risky, but the potential outcome that it would have can be either positive or negative. And so from a project perspective, we need to define our risks as either opportunities, things that could improve our project and make the outcomes better or make our project more efficient or effective. And risks can also be threats, things that will undermine or challenge our ability to be successful in the completion of our project and the achievement of our objectives. Any risk that we identify in the planning of our project can be an acceptable one to take on if the potential benefit or the mitigation of the challenge balances against the amount of effort that we would have to put in, either additional cost or additional resources, in order to make sure that that risk event has the most opportunity to occur or is mitigated and prevented in terms of its impact on the project. The way we identify these risks is to do a risk assessment. We want to understand what risks are there to our project, but more importantly, which are the ones that we need to plan for? What are the ones that are going to present the most potential opportunity or threat to our project, and what are the ones that we can actually do something about in the plan of our project to be able to address those in a way that still allows our project to be effective and efficient. When we identify our risks, we need to analyze each of them to understand these three elements. What specifically will be the consequences if that risk event happens? So what specifically will happen if that risk event occurs? What is the probability or likelihood that it is going to happen? And what is the overall impact on the project itself? So not just the specific things that will happen as a result of that, of the risk event, but what else will be changed in our project as a result of that risk. So I'll give you a real common one to identify or to think about with that. A key risk in many projects is the departure from the project of the lead PI. The PI retires or gets a job offer to move to another institution, and so can no longer serve as the leader of that particular project. So we can look at that as a risk and say, well, what would be the consequences if that would happen? That would cause a change in leadership. Somebody else would have to step up into the leadership role for the project, and we would have to determine whether the influencers, the institutions, and the funders would even allow that kind of change to happen. But that would be the immediate consequences, as there would need to be a change in leadership. What is the probability that this is going to happen? And each project would need to identify this on their own, but generally, if you have a PI who's applying for funding to do a specific project and they have a long-term relationship with their collaborators and with their institution, and they're of a vintage where it's not likely that they're going to be retiring during the course of the project, then the probability of that kind of change happening is actually quite low. And then the overall impact. What else would change about the project if that PI were to depart? Would there be a risk that the money associated with the project would be terminated because it was associated directly with that individual? So not just a change in leadership, but all of the other activities on the project would be affected by that. So we would do that kind of analysis of a risk and then determine how much effort do we have to put into planning to mitigate that kind of a risk. And given the probability of that happening, we might have a conversation about what might we do if that occurs, but we wouldn't necessarily put a lot of detailed plans in place for what we would do in the event that that would happen. We would need to acknowledge that the risk was there, but we wouldn't necessarily put a lot of effort into planning for it. So some of the ways that we can analyze risks, there's a couple of formalized brainstorming approaches that we can take that I'm going to touch on here. We can also, if we're not able to bring the project team together to do the analysis as a group, or maybe the work that we're doing is so new that we don't have the resources within our team to even understand the kinds of risks that we might be encountering, we would want to interview other people with expertise in the field, or maybe people who have done similar types of projects in the past, to get their perspective on where we might anticipate some risks within our project. And we're assessing the risks of the project work, but also the risks in how we're going to manage it, the way in which we set up our management structures. We need to make sure that those are helping to address some of the risks around the challenges to the project. So what the first approach that we might take in terms of brainstorming around analyzing the risk are what's called the 635 analysis. And this can actually be an any number, any number, any number analysis. It's just 635 is how it was originally constructed. Essentially, you have 6 people on your project team, and you, as a group, take some time to assess what the risks are by having everybody write down what they perceive are the risks, both the opportunities and the threats to the success of the project. Where are the things that they think the project has a great opportunity to succeed, and where are the areas that they think there might be a threat or a challenge to that success? Everybody writes down 3 things. And then it sounds very juvenile, but trust me, it works. You pass a piece of paper to the left and you do it again. And everybody writes, you don't write down the same thing that you've already written, and you don't write down one that you've already read. So if somebody's already identified that as a risk, you don't repeat it. You're trying to come up with a list of uniquely identified risks, opportunities, and threats for the project. Once you've exhausted the team from being able to do that, you have a complete list then of all of the risks associated with, or potential risks associated with the project, and you can then do an analysis of that list to prioritize them. Another approach that you can take is known as a SWOT analysis, and this is a little bit more detailed, but I find it's even more effective for project teams to identify not just risks, which would be the opportunities and threats, but maybe some things inherent in the way the project is set up or designed that can represent strengths and weaknesses that could then potentially offset some of those external risks, the opportunities and threats. In a SWOT analysis, you usually have a leader or a facilitator, so someone from outside of the project team, to facilitate a dialogue with the project team members around where do they see the strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and threats to the success of their project. So strengths and weaknesses are things that are internal to the project and the project team. So things that the project team can already has significant expertise in, that gives them maybe a competitive advantage when it comes to doing the work that they're proposing to do. Weaknesses, of course, would be areas where we're planning to do some work, but actually we don't know how to do that yet. Things that we would need to improve, or things that we already know are not working as well as we need them to, but things that we can address within the project team itself. When looking at the external risks to the project, the opportunities and threats, opportunities would include things that could lead to additional development. So if we think about those optional requirements from the stakeholders, things that we might be able to capitalize on that would make our project even more successful, questions that we're going to ask, or areas that we're going to explore that, if we identify the things that we think we're going to identify, will actually lead to whole new avenues of research and opportunity. And of course, funding opportunities would be in there as well. And threats are things that are going to challenge our ability to be successful. And again, opportunities and threats are things that are outside of the project, so not necessarily or at all within the control of the project or the project team, but things that the team needs to be aware of and monitor to make sure that they can respond to them if they occur, or manage how they're going to deal with those things when they happen. Whatever risks it is that we identify, we need to prioritize the ones that we're going to pay attention to. So all of our risks, again, we can assign a score to them based on the probability that they're going to happen and the potential overall impact of those risks if they occur on the project. You can make this ranking and prioritization as complex or as simple as you want it to be. There are programs out there that will simulate all of the activities on a project and give you a very detailed statistical determination as to whether something's going to occur and what its impact is going to be. If you were sending a rocket to Mars or planning an Olympic Games, you might use a very detailed risk calculation approach. But in research projects, generally, there are so many variables around what is going to happen, because what you're exploring are things that are unknown, that taking a more simplistic approach is probably more appropriate. So you want to identify what are the risks that have a high probability of occurring and and the most significant potential impact to your project. And then those would be the risks that you would spend time trying to address and incorporate risk mitigation strategies or risk capitalization strategies, so taking advantage of opportunities in your project plan. So some key examples and research projects to think about when it comes to risks. Funding is certainly a big one for all research projects. Will your project have sufficient funding to be able to do all of the things that it needs to do to address its question or solve its problem? In this day and age, very frequently when we receive grant funding or other funding for research projects, there are shortfalls that happen in terms of the total dollar amounts that are awarded. Sometimes there's an impact because of the delays of funding. We may write a grant application and a budget in 2019, but not actually receive approval to proceed with that work until early 2021, by which point a lot of the costs that we had anticipated will have changed. And that can have an impact on our ability to be successful because the funds that were awarded don't go as far as we need them to. So those would be examples of threats or challenges to the success of a project. We could also have opportunities that come in as a result of the initial stages of the work that we do. We're able to garner additional funding to support our project. And new funding or additional funding can represent a great opportunity to expand, maybe take on some of those desirable requirements or optional requirements within a project that weren't necessarily considered before. But we do have to also consider the full breadth of the changes that we would be introducing with new funding. The probability that's going to happen, if it does occur, we can't count on it, but if it does occur, that's great. But we need to think about both the positive and the challenging impacts that new funding has. New funding brings new stakeholders to the table, which means additional requirements that we then have to incorporate into our plan. Other areas would include personnel. We've touched already on what would happen if there was a change in a leadership on a project. But anytime we introduce new personnel to a project, there are some risks or challenges associated with that. There's also some significant opportunities, and a new person joining a project team could be a blockbuster addition to a team and bring new perspectives and new ideas to the work that hadn't been seen before and have a really positive impact. New personnel can also be incredibly challenging because maybe they need additional training to be able to do the work as it needs to be done within a project, which can take time away from the conduct of the research, etc. And that kind of thing can happen when personnel change throughout the life of a project as well. Another area is changes in technology. In the field in which I work in DNA sequencing, this is a big challenge for us all the time because the technology to do our work is constantly changing and advancing. In the time that I've been here at the Genome Sciences Center, it's been 15 or so years, the technology has changed quite dramatically to the point where we can now do things that were not even dreamed of 15 years ago. But the technology changes all the time, and the equipment that we use to do our work, we've had to do whole replacements of all of our sequencing and equipment in the lab once every 2 years in the last 10 years, which is a significant risk/threat to the success of our funding, because we do need to get additional funding to replace that technology on an ongoing basis. IT and computing equipment is another area of technology that we need to be mindful of in terms of how that's changing and how people are using it, particularly when it comes to sharing sensitive information and how we're storing that and how we're managing it and the ways in which the technology is changing for data transfer and data storage. That, again, there's both positives and negatives around that. Needing to change our technology introduces some additional cost. Opportunities to change the technology might mean we can do things that we didn't think we could do before. And understanding the consequences, probability, and impacts of those things are a big part of planning our work. And lastly, the competition. In research space, there are often other people who are doing the same or similar kinds of research work or asking the same or similar kinds of questions. And we can find ourselves in the midst of a research project that suddenly appears on the cover of a journal that somebody's already done the work to address the question that we thought we were working to address. And so being aware of what's happening in our field can help us anticipate and perhaps address some of the risks around what our competitors are doing, maybe by proposing collaborations, maybe by just maintaining that level of awareness so that we can change or speed up some of the work that we're doing in order to make sure we remain competitive. So as I said before, we call this risk management, but that's again a bit of a misnomer because we can't manage risk. We can only manage how well prepared we are for it and what it is that we will do in the event that that risk happens. And that's why risk is a big part of project planning, looking at understanding what those risks might be, and thinking about the ways in which we might respond to those risks if they occur. This is all about documentation and control. We want to avoid being taken by surprise by anticipating what some of our opportunities and threats might be and having not necessarily a detailed plan depending on the risks we're talking about, but at least some level of awareness so that we're not taken by surprise when it happens. Risk events, when they occur in a project, can be hugely disruptive if we haven't at least thought about what we might do in the event that something like that occurs. Another big challenge with risk management is being honest about risks in a project. In my experience, bringing researchers together to discuss what the risks might be to their project, it's very difficult sometimes for them to say that they don't know how to do something or that they're not aware of what else might be going on in the field. And that's part of the reason that the SWOT analysis approach can be incredibly useful. It follows along the psychology that some of you might have experienced if you've ever been for a job interview. You are asked the question, what are your strong points for the position that you're being considered for? And the next immediate question is, and what are the areas that you need some improvement in? Or what are your weaknesses? For this particular position. The SWOT analysis follows that same approach by allowing research teams to talk about their strengths and the things that they are good at, and then immediately asking them to focus on the areas that they need some improvement in so that they're more likely to be honest about those in that discussion. We don't get anywhere by not acknowledging that a risk event might happen. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes it harder to deal with if it does occur, because then it takes us by surprise. So in summary, risks are uncertain events that are external to the project, so not things that we can control in and of themselves, but things that we can be aware of and manage how we're going to respond to them. We need to be mindful of both opportunities and threats, things that could go well, things that could go not so well, and be aware of how we're going to deal with both of those types of things. Documenting what those are, prioritizing, and then planning for the ones where it makes the most sense to plan for them, but at least maintaining that level of awareness, and then controlling and monitoring, and then implementing responses as needed. Making sure that we're understanding not just the consequences of the risk event when it occurs, but what is the overall impact to the project itself. The changes that we make in response to a risk event can have other consequences within the project as a whole. All right, so let's to have some thinking about this. Let's look at case study or scenario number 2, which is the trainee symposium. So what would we think are some of the opportunities and some of the threats to the success of this project that we would want to consider in the planning of this project? Oh, good one. Does the date conflict with some other similar or major event? Oh, yes. That's something that a lot of us who plan events, that's our worst nightmare, to find out that there's some other thing going on at that same time. Risk of the guest speaker not being able to make it or canceling at the last minute. Yes, that's definitely true. There's opportunities for connection and collaboration, and certainly that's the purpose of the event, to provide that collaborative networking opportunity. Oh, weather conditions that may present prevent people from getting there? Yes. I once had a scientific advisory board meeting that was supposed to have 7 scientific advisory board members attend, and because of snow and rain and just miserable conditions everywhere in the world, only 2 of them ended up showing up live, which made for really interesting catering. Guest speaker reviewers that can't attend. Yeah, people canceling at the last minute. Oh, opportunities to partner with another organization. That's a really good one. I hadn't thought about that before, but yeah, the opportunity to blend with another organization and maybe enhance the opportunities for both. Risks with the venue or poor participation. Difficulty finding enough judges or people to review. Yeah, I definitely hear you about that. That's in some of the events that I manage, that's always a bit of a challenge. Incentivizing people to come is usually a good way to address that. The opportunities for networking and meeting with judges and professional development. Risk is not enough advertisement to reach people. Yeah, that can definitely be a challenge. And I guess balancing how much effort you put into advertising and advance notice in thinking about your overall budget and the level of effort that needs to go on with the project itself. Oh, IT issues on the day. Yes. Will the Wi-Fi actually work in the room where you are? Yeah, and community engagement, media interest. Oh, that's a good one too. Is there an opportunity for some promotion around the event? Wi-Fi always works. Yeah, right. Oh, will the venue be appropriate to set up posters? Yeah. Again, that's something in every event that I've managed. That's always been a problem. Sorry, a challenge. Okay, so some of the ones that I came up with in terms of opportunities, who knows, maybe you'll send out an invitation to a guest speaker, a real star in your field, and they'll actually agree to come because they want to come to your city or they happen to be there anyway, or something along those lines. And that's, again, an opportunity. You're definitely going to get a lot more attention for your event. But remember that all of those things have a bit of a double edge to them. Having a guest speaker, a real star come into your event brings with it the opportunity for more promotion and potentially more funding and potentially more attendees. But will that mean that you can no longer fit in your venue? Will you need to consider looking at a bigger space, which would then mean some additional cost to your event? So we need to think about, again, those the opportunities, the probabilities, the consequences, and the overall impact. The management and training experience, so the person or people who are tasked with managing this event, with putting it on, this represents an opportunity for them to get some training and experience in doing this kind of thing and managing this kind of project. And then there's the exposure for the department. So again, maybe attracting new trainees to come into the department, getting some additional recognition by the institution for putting on a really well done event. All of those kinds of things would represent opportunities. Potential threats or challenges, again, the venue availability. Are you going to be able to find a place that's of the appropriate size and scale or panache of the kind of thing that you want to have? Will it be available? Will you be able to afford it within the budget for your event? Maybe you can't get a star. Maybe you can't get anybody as a guest speaker for your event. That could be quite a challenge. Maybe the timing isn't right. Maybe there is another event going on and all the people that you would like to have are already booked for something else. And then lastly, just the overall interest of the community. What if not enough people sign up to make it an event that's successful? Great. Thank you all for your participation in that. So just a real quick summary of our presentation today. We looked at stakeholders and classifying them into either those who are involved, those who have an influence, those with an interest, and those who will be impacted. And when we think about risks, we want to make sure we think about both opportunities and threats and think about the impacts of those things and the consequences within our projects. Next webinar that we do in April, we will look at defining scope and quality for our projects in terms of developing our plan. And with that, I will finish and see if anybody has any questions.
Thanks very much, Robin. It's really interesting to think how much emotion comes into this. You know, when you talked about expectations and the way people feel about the project, that can really have an effect. So yeah, thanks for covering that. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. And I think there may be some questions coming in.
Yep.
And we'll give people a few minutes to go through that. That case study number 2 there, it's a bit, anyone who does event planning, oh my goodness, like some of those situations really are nightmares.
Oh yeah.
Like you said, but it's good to prepare ahead. You know, if this might happen, then let's think about, you know, how we can address that or mitigate that.
Yep. Yeah, and when we in the next session when we talk about quality, that's where again understanding what those requirements and expectations are in terms of how good is good enough
Mm-hmm.
for the event. That becomes really relevant when you're having to make those decisions about risk events when they occur, and even sometimes the timing of when a risk event occurs will make a difference, which will again we'll talk about that when we talk about project change. But when something happens will play a role in how you respond to it and what you're able to do about those things.
Absolutely.
All right, so Rachel says, not necessarily being able to articulate expectations, strategies for gaining insight into expectations if they're not well articulated. Yes, a lot of this really just comes down to a bit of experience and a lot of discussion and conversation and documenting what it is that you understand the requirements and expectations are, and getting somebody to sign off on those. So this is a part of the documentation, but it also then allows for, if expectations are not being met at some point later on in the project, somebody says, actually, that's not what I wanted, or something along those lines, having a point of reference to say, well, when we talked about this 6 months ago, and this is what I wrote out that we said we were going to do, and you know, I gave it to you to review, and we talked about it, and that seemed right. Is there, you know, it's not about pointing blame, but it is about what's changed between when we talked 6 months ago and now when we're talking now, that we can now revise what those expectations are and see if it's possible to be incorporating those within the project plan. Once a project is underway, it is difficult, not impossible, but it's challenging to incorporate changes to those kinds of things, because some of the resources have already been spent, certainly in terms of time, but also in terms of money. Maybe there's a deadline that's looming that, again, you have to make choices about what you're going to be able to do within the remaining time available on a project. But having that initial conversation, exploring what the expectations are, asking a lot of really good questions about things, maybe even posing scenarios in that discussion about, well, what if this happens? What if we encounter this? And then documenting that for everybody, so that it's clear as much as possible what it is that you understand is expected. And they have an opportunity right then at the beginning to say, actually, no, that's not what I meant. Thinking about the tire swing as a way of making sure that we're on the right page is a good way to think about that. Drawing out what it is that you're planning to build before you actually build it can go a long way to making sure people say, oh, no, that's not what I had in mind, before you actually start doing any of the work on the project. Yeah, and having the follow-ups with people throughout the life of a project. So not, it's really important to have ongoing lines of communication throughout a project that people can can get updates. They know when they are going to get updates about things and what those will cover, so that they're not bothering you with, hey, what's going on? Hey, what's going on? But at the same time, making sure that you're using those touch points or those meetings or those stage gates, however you want to call it, as ways of making sure that you're still on track to meet those expectations. It doesn't do you any good to realize you didn't meet the expectations at the end of the project. And you can do your best to understand them at the beginning, but people are also people and things will change over time. And so making sure you're having that check-in is important. Resources for managing stakeholders. This is really dependent on the scale of the project and the type of stakeholders that you're dealing with. For example, if let's use the event thing as a one way, a project that we might look at, you would use a different approach there. Maybe you would have a website. Maybe that would include a blog with updates about speakers that have been engaged or registration dates that are happening, that kind of thing. That might be one way in which you're managing stakeholders and giving them a venue to get their input. A lot of it really is just about communication and making sure when you're giving out information, what kind of information you're giving out, what the opportunities are for questions or feedback or for changes, so that there is a clarity around how that information is supposed to go, and also clarity around who gets to make decisions and how those are made. And we'll talk a lot about that in the in-person session around team leadership and team management. Working across cross-cultural situations with Indigenous can really change stakeholder engagements. Yes, indeed. And again, a big thing around community stakeholders, regardless of the type of community, a big thing about it is you're often dependent on one or two representatives of that community to give your information to and to get input from, and making sure that the people that you're talking with are representative of that community is really important, that they are actually empowered to and representative of the community that you're engaging with. You certainly can't deal with every single person in a, if it's a town of 5,000 people, you can't get sign off from every single person there. So you need to make sure that the ones that you're interacting with that purport to represent that community actually have the mandate from that community and are speaking on their behalf. And when a challenge with communities is that those representatives can change throughout the life of your project. And so being aware of and responsive to and respectful of those new faces when they come in is important. I don't have a magic formula for how you deal with that, but it is important to be mindful of that as a risk. Again, both an opportunity and a threat. Okay, I think we're at the top of the hour, so unless anybody's got additional questions.
Thanks so much, Robin. And I see another comment. And thanks to Natalie and Meredith and Margaret and Rachel for your questions and comments. And thanks to everyone for participating in the exercises. So I'll stop talking now so Robin can comment.
Oh, I'm just seeing a lot of thank yous. So thank you all for your time today and for your active participation. It makes these webinars a lot more fun for me when there's not crickets on the other end of the line. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for being an engaged group. We do hope that you enjoyed today's webinar, and special thanks to Robin for presenting another excellent webinar for us. We are going to send out a short survey, and thank you to everyone who filled out the last survey. Your feedback really does help us improve and continue to offer topics that are useful to you. So have a great day, everyone.